Hello, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome. Also from me, Katie, thank you very much for your introduction, and also greetings to all of you joining us via the live stream. As Katie mentioned, our next topic is the transition to net zero. And it's a very important topic because, unfortunately, the travel and tourism sector plays a significant role in fueling climate change. In fact, some recent studies put the impact at between 8 and 11% of global carbon emissions. And that's very surprising. It was to me, and it's really significant. At the same time, we all know that the travel and tourism industry is especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And this is true in particular for many destination countries in regions such as Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and of course also the island nations. So to protect the health and also the success of this industry, it's really important that we take decisive action to combat the effects of climate change. And in the next hour or so, we're going to hear about several ways that this is already happening and also discuss possible ways to getting to net zero quicker and more efficiently. We're going to begin with a panel, we're going to begin with a keynote on the possible pathways to net zero in the tourism sector. And after that, we will have our global roundtable, which is a panel discussion with politicians and decision makers from around the world. But next, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. He is the CEO of the Travel Foundation. Some of you are, of course, familiar with this organization. It's a leading international sustainable tourism NGO. And for more than 20 years, Travel Foundation has been dedicated to ensuring that tourism has a positive impact on destinations. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Jeremy Sampson. Jeremy, hello.
Thank you.
So, Jeremy, we had to wait for the jingle music. Jeremy is a dynamic person who's very, very dedicated, and we were just talking before the session how great it is that sustainable tourism is in focus. This is no longer a niche topic. It's a very central topic, very important, and I know people like you have been working in this area for a long time. This is not your first rodeo at the ITB. What does it feel like to see this topic finally get the attention it deserves?
Yeah, well, we never felt it was a niche ourselves, but for many years we were in Hall 4.1 sharing these ideas and topics with our colleagues in adventure tourism and in the sustainable tourism space. But sustainability is not a tick box. It's not a niche. It is here to be integrated with the conversation around our industry's future, and that's what we're here to do today.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to your keynote, and the stage is yours, Jeremy.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, it is great to be here, and I want to thank ITB Berlin for the invitation and for giving such prominence to our conversation today. I'm here to share some research findings with you all. Please, everyone, I implore you to take these findings and overlay them onto everything that you hear this week at this conference. If it's not compatible, ask why not. It's time for us to get real, and it's time to call out the tension that sometimes exists between where our industry is headed and where our planet is headed. So the title of our presentation is Let's Get Real, and as I'm about to show, we have a lot of work to do. The good news is the future is also full of opportunity, and those who step up to the challenge will be able to take advantage of this moment at the same time. I'm invited here today to speak about the research that we published last year in collaboration with Breda University, the Center of Expertise in Leisure, Tourism and Hospitality, the European Tourism Futures Institute, and the Netherlands Board of Tourism and Conventions. Paul Peters and Bernadette Pop were the principal authors, and we are grateful to those logos which are listed on the screen who provided support and supported this research financially or in kind. The full report is freely available on the Travel Foundation website if you wish to if you wish to have a look. Why did we engage in this report in Vision 2030? The context is the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Action in Tourism, as well as the Paris Agreement, these international agreements which we have aligned with and asked our industry to sign up to, asks our signatories to have emissions by 2030 and reach net zero no later than 2050, but we had never asked the question, well, what does that actually look like for travel and tourism at a global scale? Is there compatibility between the future of this industry, business as usual growth trajectory, and a decarbonized and thriving travel and tourism economy? What does that compatibility look like? Can we envision such a future? So we conducted this research in 2022 based on a systems modeling technique. And this modeled global transport and accommodation for domestic and international trips of any kind that were at least one night away from home, including holidays, business travel, visiting friends and family. And what did we find? You can see from this model that the business as usual, that the scale of this task is pretty steep. Under a business as usual paradigm, emissions are set to rise fairly steeply, not fall. So by 2050, tourism-related emissions will increase under this business as usual framework by 73% from 2019. In such a scenario, tourism will be responsible for 66% of the world's remaining carbon budget between 2023 and the year 2100. And of course, this is completely incompatible with a target of reducing emissions by 50% by 2030 or net zero by 2050. So you can already see that the challenges are pretty enormous. Within the model, there are 40 different interventions which you can dial up or dial down based around the 7 categories which are shown on the screen. We were looking for scenarios which could maintain anticipated future growth in revenue and trips while still meeting these decarbonization targets. Aside from the obvious benefits for our economy and the risks presented by the alternatives, the reason for seeking to retain growth in trips is because this is what is projected to happen anyway. Trips are projected to double by 2050 simply based on factors like population growth and increase in income and affordability in non-Western economies. Of course, it would be possible to cut emissions by just reducing travel and placing restrictions on the industry, but I'm not sure anyone here is excited about that idea. This would require COVID-like measures that would curtail our freedom. And while this may not be out of the question in the future as we grapple with the challenges of climate change, we're looking for scenarios that would help us to avoid such a future and support travel and tourism, in particular, the destinations which rely on tourism, of which there are many. So our aim was to identify a few different scenarios that would help us create this compatibility and reach net zero, a few different pathways. However, it was soon apparent that every effective measure would need to be dialed all the way up to the top without delay, and this would help us only make a dent in emissions. As such, we found only one scenario, which we call the decarbonization scenario. But combining all of the measures, adding a policy of reducing the rate of growth of aviation, and keeping the total distance traveled by air to about today's levels, we did get close to net zero by 2050. You can see from the graph that the turnaround from global emissions growth to emission reduction doesn't quite happen soon enough. It does not help us reach the 2030 target, so we can't quite track that red line. But we can follow a similar trajectory just a few years late and meet the 2050 target. We consider this to be good news. We find here that it's possible for the world to continue to travel and for tourism to thrive in 2050 in a net zero world. In our decarbonization scenario, the amount of trips, revenue, and guest nights all match business as usual. This feels like good news. So how did we do it? Put simply, we must only grow the areas of tourism that are most ready to decarbonize and stop growing those that are the most challenging, at least for a little while, if we're to have any chance of reaching these climate targets by 2050. And so it's really impossible to talk about seriously decarbonizing tourism without addressing some of the key issues, namely aviation. So aviation is particularly polluting. It is responsible for 55% of all of tourism's emissions in 2019, and long-haul flights are particularly in this category. The longest distance trips, so think the equivalent of flying from Shanghai to Sydney or further and back, are responsible for 19% of all of tourism's global carbon emissions, yet they only account for 1.9% of all trips. So clearly, any plan for decarbonizing travel and tourism must grasp this particular challenge. Electrification, coupled with a shift to renewable energy or nuclear energy, will be the route to decarbonization for most accommodation providers and transportation modalities over the coming decades. Of course, there's a huge task ahead. I'm not saying that this is easy, but with the right policies, with the right investments, the right incentives, this can happen. Decarbonization will not be easy for anyone, but at least road providers, rail transport providers, ferry companies, and hotel companies understand that they can decarbonize within available technology, available electrification, and investment in renewable energy. These solutions are readily available, and with the right investment will occur. On the other hand, aviation is what's known as hard to abate. This term describes where electrification, unfortunately, does not offer us a near-term solution, and we are many decades away from having a global fleet of electric planes, especially ones that can fly long haul. So what about offsetting? Let's make things clear. The term net zero has been used by some to carry on with business as usual, using the equation fossil fuel burning plus offsetting equals zero. However, net zero has to basically mean zero. I mean, let's focus on the zero, or as close to zero as possible. Only then does offsetting come into play. Anything else is, frankly, a greenwash. And as we've seen with some high-profile lawsuits recently and the recent EU directive on green claims, this will become increasingly difficult. In our report, we explain in some detail that by simply relying on offsets, we are creating a huge problem, and at worst, more likely a diversion of investment from needed technology and longer-term emission reduction targets and strategies that keep fossil fuels in the ground. We do not use offsetting in our scenario. An alternative to offsetting and to electrification is, of course, sustainable aviation fuels, and this is already in use. Great. This can be used with some of our existing fleets. But in 2019, the amount of SAF that's produced globally was only 0.1% of the 300 million tons of jet fuel used in commercial aviation. As Delta Airlines put it, sustainable aviation fuel is the most promising lever that we have to accelerate progress towards a net zero future. Also great. Unfortunately, there is not enough SAF today to fuel an airline Delta size for even one day. Okay. Increasing biofuel production, which would help, is problematic as there are limitations around land use and availability of organic waste. So in our model, we use synthetic e-fuels, which is the main limitation here being the availability of renewable energy needed to create sustainable synthetic kerosene, particularly in a decarbonizing world where demand for renewable energy will be increased and not only increased in demand from our sector. So it's time that we get real about what's possible. To allow for the distance traveled by air to triple, as it will need to do by 2050 in a business as usual scenario, we need 17,000 billion gallons of fuel between now and 2050. That is represented by the 17 tankers that you see on this slide. But in fact, we can only burn the amount of fossil fuel represented by three tankers here if we are to stay within the limits aligned by the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Declaration. So, what do we do? Considering we've already reached 1.5 degrees of warming in the last 12 months, every single degree and every single percentage point matters. And even with massive investment, we cannot cover the rest of demand with sustainable aviation fuel at the moment. At the best, what we could produce is represented here by 5.5 tankers. So we have to avoid growing our air miles and our dependency on this hard-to-abate modality. I don't see any other way around this. The green and orange tankers here can cover us for today's level of flying, but not for the anticipated further increases that are anticipated in our business-as-usual model. So it is only by stopping the growth in distance traveled by air, and keeping it close to 2019 levels, which were not so bad, that we give sustainable aviation fuel a chance to catch up and help us meet our needs by 2050. Now, we know there may be other advances, there may be future technology that we can't imagine yet, but I can't imagine that we sit and hope and pray for new technology to save us. We need to plan for this reality. So with the decarbonization scenario, it's pretty good news in many ways. We can continue to travel, and we can continue to fly, and we can continue to see the world without killing it. Some things will evolve in this paradigm. There will be an increased cost of flying because sustainable aviation fuel is more expensive, but alternatives will become increasingly available and cheaper, and high-speed trains, for example, we predict will become more affordable during this period. There's also huge growth opportunities. The industry needs investment. Huge investment is required, but the investment that we call for in the report, which is $3.3 trillion of investment in the industry, only represents 2 to 3% of the overall revenue that we would expect from travel and tourism during this period. That doesn't sound like a hard ask. That investment is likely to yield good return for investors as the world transitions to a decarbonized economy. New destinations will be created and discovered. It will be easy to book end-to-end trips with multiple stops, multiple modalities of transport. New partnerships will be created, and digital innovation will make all of this much more possible. And each long-haul journey that does exist, because we can still fly to the levels of 2019, will be maximized. People will stay longer, will see more, and will spend more money. This is the paradigm that we predict. So it sounds great. What's the catch? Keeping flying to today's levels or 2019 levels may seem like a small price to pay for saving the planet when you put it in this context, but of course there is a catch, and there are many. This scenario that we've developed is not necessarily likely. It's only possible, and it will require political will, investment, commitment, collaboration, and alignment, starting immediately, the likes of which we have not seen before in this industry, if we have any chance of delivering on this scenario. Do we think that all of this is in place? Not necessarily, but it is something that we can rally around and align together as an industry. There's also a question of fairness here. Who gets to burn the rest of the fuel available, sustainable or otherwise? I'll come back to this in a moment, but we do know that if we don't achieve the tourism decarbonization scenario or something that looks a little bit like it, I'm afraid the alternatives may be more challenging. We may face draconian restrictions to global mobility. We may miss international science-based targets and further exceed 1.5 degrees with all that implies for the world and our industry, reputationally, operationally, and otherwise. And the destinations and communities that rely on tourism cannot abate this reality. Growth in global travel and tourism is practically inevitable, but growth in emissions cannot be. So let's start to get real about what this looks like. First, we need to get real with the fact that globally, tourism will continue to grow at much the same pace that it has for decades. I don't know that that's avoidable. But growth in emissions is not inevitable. So we need to get real about all of these different kinds of growth that people are talking about. What about green growth? Is it really possible? Perhaps. Our scenario shows that green growth might be a scenario, but can we take comfort with the fact that we make progress with green growth while emissions continue to rise? I'm not sure. It's important to consider things like emissions intensity. Yes, the volume of emissions per trip, which many companies, destinations are starting to focus on. We're making progress here, and there are promising signs, but reductions in emissions intensity are easily wiped out by overall growth in trips taken. And so ultimately, I don't know that the planet cares about emissions intensity, it cares about absolute emissions. We're here in the capital of Germany, and about the same time as we published our report, WTTC published Germany's travel and tourism climate footprint last year. This just described a decoupling of emissions from growth because emissions grew at a slower rate, 1.1% per year than economic growth, 1.5% between 2010 and 2019. But there's no getting away from the fact that that is an increase in emissions every year, when we need emissions to be falling. If it's a business or destination, you cannot grow tourism without growing your emissions. I think there's a question about whether growth is something that we should be aiming for. The world will decarbonize, and that will happen with or without you. Tourism will need to fit into this world and will need to play its part to deliver on this outcome. So there are many policies emerging. Here are just a few on this slide which have focused on Europe. Here in Germany, they've doubled taxes on tickets for short-haul flights, and in 2021, a government industry agreement was made to ramp up power-to-liquid e-fuel, creating enough power to fuel the equivalent of a third of domestic flights by 2030. Very nice progress. EU-wide, airports will be mandated to supply sustainable aviation fuel, starting with 2% of fuel in 2025, building up to 70% in 2050. These are the frameworks that will help us to get there. All of this points to where we are headed, with regulators, consumers, investors, the industry coalescing around the need to accelerate climate action at scale and in reality. What do we need to see before this decade is out to be on track? I'm going to propose 5 milestones that will help us know if we are on the path to success. The first one, global emissions accounting. This means bringing international transport emissions within national and business carbon targets. Even veterans of the industry are surprised to discover that international emissions from flights and crews are not part of the Paris Agreement processes and sit outside of most decarbonization legislation. They are considered ghost emissions. No one is responsible for them. Regulation is needed so that these emissions become limited and finite. Businesses are calling for this, recognizing the need to create the right incentive for decarbonizing and level the playing field. There are many options, but if we add these global emissions to the national carbon budgets of destinations, rather than the source market that they come from, this could bring many additional benefits. We could allocate the extra carbon budget fairly. Destinations can choose how they want to spend their carbon budget, including whether they'd like to spend it on tourism at all. And they will seek the kind of tourism and the kind of markets that would maximize their benefits with minimum CO2 pollution. Norway is a good example, actually, of a country which has been looking at this very thing and optimizing value from tourists vis-a-vis the carbon costs per passenger. Next up, we need to start identifying and providing low and net zero tourism emissions tourism options at scale. Road trips, package itineraries, new cross-border train journeys. We should be seeing more and more innovation in this space and coming to market now and within the next decade. Start asking yourself, where will my products and experiences come from? The Travel Corporation and Visit Scotland have both committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and they're both Glasgow Declaration signatories we've been working with for many years. This is a public-private collaboration that is meant to inspire and support climate action within Scotland's tourism industry. We have some new announcements about this partnership coming up very soon, but the aim of this groundbreaking 3-year, 3-way partnership is to help build the capacity of Scottish businesses across the supply chain to adapt to the decarbonizing economy and strengthen the industry's resilience. The project supports the ambition of Scotland's National Tourism Strategy, of Travel Corporation's Sustainability Strategy and Climate Action Plan, and its collective mission to reduce all emissions in its tour programs globally. We will use this collaboration as a way of demonstrating what good looks like, with global leadership coming from a destination and a company working together in a new way to achieve something that is also driven by the needs of the market. This brings us to the next milestone. We need collaborations that break traditional formats. That means working across border, across public and private, pre-competitively at different levels, working across silos and with organizations outside your verticals, outside of tourism. We're currently building partnerships with tech innovators, with climate scientists, with behavior change specialists like our partners at Behavior Smart, destination authorities and others to bring action at scale to life. Much of the existing climate action in our sector, while well-intentioned, is not at the speed or scale that this situation requires to both decarbonize and adapt to the very real impacts of climate change, which are already affecting our destinations. To address this, we're focused on collaborations that rethink traditional borders and silos. After all, climate change doesn't care about your administrative boundaries. For instance, in the Pacific Northwest, we've begun exploring what collective climate action looks like. If we bring together the bioregion represented by Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, and working towards a common agenda rather than a fragmented one. Alongside our partners at Expedia Group, we've developed an online training program for destinations. We're currently piloting this with 30 or so destinations globally, and this free resource will be available later this year. It will enable destinations to connect with peers, to gain fluency in climate action and resilience, to create their own climate action plan, and to become climate champions for their destination and their community. If we act collectively, we avoid pushing the responsibility down to the little guy, as we've been doing for far too long. Small businesses and destinations without the resources to act are often being hit with multiple requests to raise standards, help demonstrate the industry's credibility and sustainability credentials, but not being supported to do so. This is a call to action for all of you to identify the bigger ecosystem within which you exist and the organizations that are best placed to influence it, and to spend the money and the resources that are required to support the change that needs to occur. This allows me to add a bonus milestone, which is to sign and implement the Glasgow Declaration. This is the global initiative supported by the UN, and I see that its biggest role is to foster collaboration, aligning ambition with others, and finding support to take action. From the very beginning, the goal was to come together to see what we as a sector could achieve and how we could contribute to the global targets laid out by the Paris Agreement. No one organization or entity can do anything about this on their own. If we come together and address the problem in a collective sense, we have a much better chance of increasing that contribution in a real way. We need to get to a point where we can call those out who have not come into the fold, and those who are not willing to look very seriously at decarbonizing and reducing their own emissions. The next milestone is around providing more effective support for the most vulnerable destinations in our world. New international channels or frameworks are needed to direct resources, particularly of the financial kind, to where they are needed most. Our report highlights how some destinations are better placed to transition to a low-carbon economy than others. How will we ensure that destinations which are less developed or completely dependent on long-haul tourism, our hardest to abate sectors like aviation and cruise, are not left behind? The next step in climate action and tourism must be to bolster destinations. This means targets, strategies, resources for building resilience, for enriching natural resources, not depleting them, for providing nature-based solutions, such as replenishing mangroves and reefs, protecting tourism assets, not destroying them, and protecting wider communities from damages that will occur as wildfires spread and as the increase in natural storms and these kinds of disasters are introduced into our paradigm. We need to build the infrastructure for wider change, and we need to support destinations during climate-based disruption and crisis. And this has to be driven by destinations and their needs, communities and their needs, not PR agendas. Because without those communities, we are nothing. I said I would come back to the issue of who gets to burn the fuel, and clearly, holding aviation at today's levels has some implications. Can we really expect developing economies in the global south to hold off from building airports and new air routes when they look at the amount of flying and connectivity that Europeans and other global north economies have and already enjoy? Of course we can't do that. So we need to start a long overdue conversation. We will be publishing in the next months a industry white paper on climate justice, and which we hope will assist with this conversation. It is a primer for climate justice in travel and tourism, and it looks at how the industry can approach climate action fairly, ensuring the most vulnerable destinations, often those who have done the least to cause this problem, can be supported. And we must act now to avoid worsening tourism's existing inequities. Because we make these choices even if we do nothing. To act or not on climate change, to consider the plight of others or not, to ignore the issues and choose short-term gain while contributing to a longer-term crisis is a choice that some are making, but it's not okay. This is my final milestone, and for me, this is the ultimate let's get real. When will tourism's emissions stop growing and start reducing? This decade? We need to get serious. If you have a sustainability plan or a climate action plan that is separated from your main business strategy, you're missing the point. The two are not compatible unless they are together. Why is all the money going towards promotion when we need meaningful investment in sustainability and climate action? I'm not opposed to marketing, I never have been, but the balance and the priorities are out of whack. It's time to stop tinkering around the edges. No more performative action seeking PR gain while keeping us on the same course towards climate disaster. We must question the shape of growth. It's not a growth versus degrowth conversation. It is much more nuanced than that. But we must question the shape. So the next time you hear about record numbers of visitors or profits or trips, at least let's ask, does this come with an increase in emissions? If so, in today's world, how can that be anything other than not okay? So let's applaud those who are leading the way by tapping into the growth areas that we can identify, those that will enable us to increase trips, increase revenue, and continue to travel without destroying the very resources that we depend on. Our mission and our challenge as an industry is a big one. This is a big task for our generation. It's not just to urgently decarbonize, but to do so in a way that builds greater fairness and resilience into our system for the long run. So I've shared the decarbonization scenario. I've shared the milestones. Delivering on this transformation will require some skills. It will require bold leadership, not just from your under-resourced sustainability team, but from your C-suite decision makers and boards. It will require capacity change that we have not seen, not just training, but an enabling environment that promotes tough conversations like this one, opening up resources that address the very real risks occurring right now, every day in our industry, affecting our reputation and social license to operate. And we need to see change at scale, right-sized change. Taking significant action means doing things differently, understanding and acting on our sphere of influence to prioritize science alongside all of the other stakeholders, and designing the unsustainable options right out of the system. So let's not only envision 2030, let's get real. And I'm really looking forward to doing so in our upcoming panel discussion. Thank you.